There we go. So hello everyone. It's really amazing to see so many old friends and new friends joining us this evening. I'm Sarah Bowden. I'm the curator of Hardwick Gallery at the University of Gloucestershire, hosting this evening. As the gallery is temporarily closed over this academic year, we've commissioned Louise K Wilson to work with us as an artist at distance, working on a project that explores and activates the special collections and archives at the university through a series of blog posts and other activities on the Hardwick Gallery website. So do check out the blog there. Before I hand over to our chair, Jean Boyd, I'd like to run through the order this evening. So after Jean says hello, Louise and Rona will give short introductions to their practices, and then we'll discuss their shared interests for around 45 minutes. We'll then hold a Q&A, so please feel free to enter a question into the chat feature or a comment at any point during the conversation. I'd recommend that you watch this session on speaker view, and I'm going to be keeping microphones off. You're free to keep your cameras on if you like, but also to turn them off. Hopefully there'll be no glitches, but please bear with us if there are. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jean. Thank you, Jean.
Hey, thank you, Sarah. And I'd like to reiterate that welcome to everybody here this evening. It's wonderful to see so many people with us. And it's my great pleasure to introduce our two artists that we are in conversation with, that Sarah has briefly introduced, Rona and Louise. Rona's practice is multidisciplinary. It's research-led, and I would describe it as responding to the context of her investigations. And Rona's work always pays close attention to the use of media and the resonances that come with these. Recently, she has produced a piece of work called In Love with the Lithosphere, which has involved the use of historic postcards to explore views and perceptions around landscape. Louise has just been introduced to us as well by Sarah as our resident artist at a distance. Louise's practice is similarly research-led and multidisciplinary. It often includes responses to the sort of technological uncanny and the use of sort of sensing media, with an interest in archives and landscapes and geology. And as Sarah mentioned, Louise is working with us on the Cheltenham volumes during her residency. It's really wonderful to have both of you together, and we're very interested to explore some of the convergences and possibly divergences in your practice. So what I'd like to do now is hand over to you, Rona, to give us a little introduction to your lines of inquiry and your areas of concern in your practice.
Great, Jean. Well, thank you very much to everyone for being here, and certainly to Louise, Sarah and Jean for setting this event up. So I'm going to screen share in a minute, and I'm going to read a brief sort of overview. So I'm not going to speak to the slides, but I'm going to talk to the kind of broader ideas that they seek to investigate. I'm going to turn my camera off while I do, excuse me, while I do that. So hopefully all will go well. Okay. Sorry. I just need to start that again. I assume everyone can see it.
Yes.
Thank you. Sorry, now I'm having a moment where PowerPoint is, I can't get, do bear with me. Right. Okay, I'm assuming that's now visible and running okay. Okay. Yeah, yeah. Can you see it?
Yes.
Thank you. In one of her blog entries, Louise makes a connection between the Hardwick archive and a set of geology books she inherited from her father, which now sit on the shelf in her study. This led us to discuss the ways in which, as artists whose work has largely involved investigation of different locations and communities, rather than studio-based activity, working at home has brought a changed sense of the personal into play. On the same day, I came across a quote from Barbara Hepworth, and she says, "Perhaps what one wants to say is formed in childhood, and the rest of one's life is spent trying to say it. Moving through the West Riding landscape with my father in his car, the hills were sculptures." This led me to think about my own formative influences and the ways in which landscape has functioned in my practice. The opening lines of a 1953 film about Hepworth, Figures in a Landscape, describe her as seeking to find herself in Cornwall and Cornwall in herself. For thinkers like Timothy Morton, such a statement aligns with attitudes towards nature which are predicated on its separation from culture. Ideas that he argues in the age of climate change need fundamental reconsideration. Arguably, the impact of human activity upon the systems of the planet is now on such a scale as to have occasioned an end to nature, with a capital N. Over the last 10 years, much of my work has been concerned with reflecting the ways in which we both position and imagine the phenomenal world, be it as idyll, resource, or object of study, and more recently, ways of reimagining human, non-human relations. Like Hepworth, growing up on the coast of North Devon, which has a tidal rise and fall of between 5 and 10 meters a day, has, I think, provided a kind of syntax for my practice, resulting in a series of works responding to coastal environments as boundary spaces, and more broadly, a preoccupation with the liminal and changeable. Family history has also had an influence. My grandfather and father were both seaside photographers. Hepworth's was a surveyor and Louise's a scientific engineer, making, in my case, questions of representation and the relationship between viewer and viewed another area of interest. Hepworth was apparently very concerned with the staging of her sculpture. Arguably, she was equally conscious of the ways in which playing the role of sculptor contributed to the mythos of her practice. I have often used my body in my work, but in a manner that has sought to complicate any idea of a unified self, using prosthetics, making myself into a swarm, working with shadows, undertaking mundane and repetitious actions. In approaching landscape, I am interested in a tension between distance and proximity, desire and objectification, along with the ways in which ancillary methods might give traction to the work. Between 2009 and 12, I was artist in residence at the National Oceanography Centre, working with geophysicists studying the deep seabed. In response to their attempts to literally illuminate this dark and inaccessible space, I sought instead to evoke it indirectly, foregrounding non-visual forms of perception, such as reach, touch, and imagining. The work I've been doing recently has been concerned with the operation of travel books and postcards as part of a visual economy which both collects the world and produces it. Thinking about the ways in which they interpose between here and there, home and away, has led in turn to an interest in the figure of the stay-at-home, the surrogate traveller, and the potential of fictional journeying to sidestep the problems associated with actual travel, which situates nature as a destination. The work I did at the Oceanography Centre left me with a change awareness of the planet as a dynamic entity. spawning an interest in both geological phenomena and what Bronislaw Szarzyński has called the becoming geological of the human in the Anthropocene. Right now, I'm developing a new body of work for which the starting point is the collection of rocks, along with rock collections, encompassing stones which tourists pick up as souvenirs in Hawaii, only to post them back again for fear of invoking the curse of Pele, the goddess of the island. Natural history collections, UK university collections alone contain 5 to 6 million specimens, and the philosophical appreciation of rocks in East Asian culture. The challenge of rethinking human-non-human relations is a profound one, and I see the dislocation of these materials from their landscape of origin, along with the ways in which they can be read as both natural objects and cultural artifacts, as providing useful friction in this attempt. Okay. So I'm going to stop my share. Oh, I'm viewing somebody else's screen and I don't quite know how I've done that. Hello? Yeah.
That's all good. You're back. You're back with us.
Yes,
thank you.
A moment of weirdness there, but thanks.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the kind of technological limbo we find ourselves in sometimes.
It was in someone else's computer for a moment, but anyway, I was obviously imagining traveling.
So with those really interesting thoughts and themes there, we try and hang on to those and take those over into our first introduction from Louise now. So Louise, if you would like to.
I will do.
Take over.
Thanks, Jean. I'm going to stop sharing. Stop my image and go to my PowerPoint. Share screen. Okay, just before I start, first of all, I just want to thank Rona very, very much for agreeing to participate in this. It's been an absolute pleasure, the process over the last few weeks of discussing this, and I'm really thrilled that Rona's doing this. And it's, yeah, we go back a long way, so it's really nice to revisit some of those early work and to see more recent work as well. And there's so much in that talk, so I'm looking forward to hearing more. I'm going to start now. I haven't got a title this, but it's I will give it a title. I'm going to call it From Aldermaston to the Archive. I did speak about, gave a Zoom talk before Christmas, or actually it was back in October, I think. So I will be talking about a kind of contextualization of practice prior to the residency and moving into that. Travelling in has been a core tenet of my work, a desire to get into places, using an artistic passport of admission to access active defence sites, nuclear submarines, military ruins, marine research environments, places saturated with atmosphere. The more closed sites require more of a dance of negotiation, observing etiquettes and protocols. Interest in places without or reduced captioning, Cold War sites, where the site speaks by itself, with vibrant matter that adheres to bunkers, labs and test sites. To quote Luke Bennett, toxic residues contaminate human hearts and minds, such vital properties that become more legible as the process of ruination takes hold, buildings and structures slightly breaking down into the earth. Listening to and paying attention to resonance, reverberation, it's a process of gathering echoes, using microphones of different types, archaeological or extractive processes, perhaps not capturing the sound as such, but a trace left on the recording media, malleable to be reused. Michael Gallagher argues that the microphone produces a performance, since whatever it picks up and stores as a trace for the record has been enacted and brought into being, the intangibility of sound. I'm interested in types of relationships forged with spaces. Sometimes performances using voice or sound are enacted in these historical places. It's an invocation, maybe rather than a seance. The activity sits somewhere between a scientific procedure and a quasi-religious communication or communion with immanent matter. It no longer matters if artists' measurements are accurate. A ritual is enacted that is intended to produce a body of aesthetic, sonorous material. These practices are not a means of contacting or manifesting ghosts, but rather a means of conjuring them. I like David Toop's notion of listening as a mediumship, sound being there and not being there. On occasion, the work elicits memory and forgetting, process of recording on paper, incomplete recollections committed to a vinyl record, dwelling inside an environment, dwelling with matter, acculturating to it, collecting material in the form of anecdotes, produces sensation. A long time ago, I was interested in the self as tested subject, producing data later used out of context. On the land or in the air, literally everything is thrown into perspective and perception. My fascination with space and the earth is less the intensity of space, but the words of the cosmonauts, sometimes lyrical, sometimes banal, expressing boredom, fear, homesickness. These works build on an interest in the flow of sound, sounds, voices carried on the wind, or contained and inflected by resonant architectures. The uncanniness of acousmatic voices that envelop the viewer, pervasive. More recent work, however, uses found sounds such as cinema soundtracks and a box of recorded interviews made from the age of 11 to explore a relationship with the recorded past and the voice. Like Krapp's last tape, tapes become an archive of the self, an illusion of permanence and mutability. Audio recording devices used to frame and mediate the world also subject it to the affective power of memory and sensation. Sound technology also generates and reproduces sound. That's what's called noise in the case of the cassette. Noise is created by the oxides that coat the tape surface, a sounding of the medium's material and technological basis. Cassette tapes are deeply associated with our childhood memories of recording voices, listening to music, expressing our past memories, as well as recollections of poor signals and incompatible noise reproduction and reduction. However, and this is a quote, the desire for the old is not merely nostalgia for lost aesthetics, rather it implies an alternative view on history, the memory of the past itself. I'm now at the Hardwick. I'm now traveling inside the archive and the material that has been electronically transferred to me. I'm increasingly playing with how it can be loosened. Less reverential, but hopefully not disrespectful. I'm playing with property again. For the most recent blog, I was playing with a chunk of galena taken out of Small Clough Mine, letting it sparkle again, letting the toxicity out. My father was an amateur geologist, and I just remember his hobby being a holiday curse. But now I'm traveling back to rocks and to ruins and viewing them differently.
Thank you, Louise. And I mean, there we have, again, such interesting sort of echoes and resonances and sort of possibilities of sort of transposition between media that you're discussing. So I think I might like to start our conversation with you both this evening to see whether you might expand a little bit more on your uses of technologies that span both, I suppose, kind of social functions, public functions, but also a sense of maybe sometimes private or personal memory, and the way that those in a way can evoke and record and, as you said, Rona, kind of actually produce a sense of space or a sense of place or landscape. Sort of framing the landscape in different ways, I think, is something that I can see in both your practices as something that moves between image making that involves a kind of ideal view, so the postcards and the images in the Cheltenham volumes, for instance, and the views of landscape that are in the For Love of the Lithosphere, Rona. So I wondered whether you might say a little bit more about these alternate sort of access points to landscape and place, one that in a way presents us with an ideal view, but the other that sees the natural world as a set of resources that we might exploit.
Well, one thing that comes to mind in response to that is when I have a large collection now of postcards which feature either landscape or rocks, or the combination of. And I suppose certainly the period I spent some time looking at, which is the 1960s, roughly speaking, which is described as the golden age of capitalism, when the sort of the sense of humankind's sort of progress, human progress, was sort of comfortable and assured, whether that was economic or technological. And within that, there are often images of mines, of reservoirs, of road building. So at the same time as there is this sort of scenic representation, there's also this sort of sense of a kind of colonization of the landscape. I mean, civil engineering projects feature very highly. So in that sense, I suppose there is that the kind of imagery that we might be interested in now, which is a kind of dystopian imagery. I mean, not necessarily at a popular level, but nevertheless, I think, artistically, it sort of seems to, the imagery I'm looking at almost seems to sort of project towards a future that we know hasn't kind of played out in the same way. And that's one of the things I'm interested in, this sort of movement between this progressive imagery that actually is now our past. So I think that's something that's quite interesting. And I suppose I have often been also interested in quite sort of obsolete technologies. Like I did some work with Morse code and so forth. And I've done a certain amount of photographic work where I've tried to sort of subvert the camera and either make prints that, without a darkroom or without a lens, or to flood the camera with light so that it actually can't focus, or use cameras underwater where the movement of the water stops them focusing. So I'm sort of, there's something about these ways of framing the world that, it's those mechanisms that I think I find interesting. Perhaps, although not exclusively, more than being in those landscapes. I mean, although that is obviously something that, I am interested in, but I think in the practice somehow it's this separation and attraction towards that I'm interested in. Don't know if that entirely answers your question, but anyway.
Well, I think what you're describing there is the way the apparatus is always very present in the work. So we're in a way it's a dialogue both with what the apparatus does and the way the apparatus might attempt to kind of colonize that space. But it's also a consciousness of that apparatus being very present through the way that you push it, or you push it beyond its capabilities, or strain it in some way. And again, I mean, that reminds me a lot of, some of your methodology, Louise, as well, and also some shared interests there in those visions.
Yes, I mean
that sort of zombie modernism that.
I mean, that's how it connected really with this idea for this event was because of a particular blog entry I'd done with manipulation of some postcard imagery, and it was obviously wonderful to then have an insight into Rona's practice. I actually want to ask Rona a little bit more about the images that we saw in the slideshow of the there was one of Haytor and there was another rock formation where you'd applied a sort of digital effect to create this vertiginous sort of effect, which is quite disturbing actually. And I was kind of wondering if you could say a little bit more about that and what the...
Yeah, I mean, I suppose some of the things I included, what's interesting is I think I've sort of been working in slightly different ways in the last couple of years, where there has been perhaps more studio-based activity than there might have been historically. There's quite a lot of things that I have which have not fully become work somehow because they're not situated somewhere, but so some of the imagery I included is sort of experiments, but I suppose I included them to sort of try and illuminate a way of thinking as much as to sort of you know, show the kind of end result. So I did spend quite a lot of time where I was rather sort of obsessively trying to lay postcards out to create continuous landscapes. And you see that a bit in the waterfalls, which fall one into the other. But I had quite a few, and I made it very difficult for myself because I didn't allow myself to glue them down. So they all had to be kind of positioned. And there was something about the kind of attempt to order them and the resistance that they offered that I really felt was very useful. I think I find it useful if I'm working with things and they slightly resist me somehow. I make it difficult for myself. But the digital manipulation, which you know, I like the effect of, but I have a kind of, I haven't resolved in myself the way that it dematerializes the actual cards. Of course, that happens really quickly, you know, and suddenly you get this kind of disturbance. It partly came out of, because I was also doing quite a lot of tracing of the postcards and taking out aspects of the scene. So you ended up with these figures gesticulating towards something, which when you edit bits of it out, as I say, this was done by hand, you end up with this kind of quite sort of science fiction-like landscape where a body of water is rushing towards somebody, or a rock is shooting up and they're pointing, and instead of that sort of sense that the original images have, that, you know, all is well with the world and I can sort of welcome you into it as an intermediary, you know, the figure in the picture is an intermediary between you, the viewer, and the landscape. I mean, it comes out of certain painterly traditions. In this case, it feels like they're pulling back, you know, suddenly the image is kind of kicking back. And I think I had this sense when I was doing those manipulations of the way of a kind of way in which this, you know, nature, well, I don't, actually nature's not the right word. Somehow this phenomena was resisting being kind of framed and ordered. So I think that was what I quite liked about them, you know, the visual distortion. But as I say, I think there's something about, you know, what form they would take as a piece. I haven't quite sorted out yet, because I don't know that simply printing them out is the answer. Anyway, so that's the answer.
Really interesting. They're kind of exerting an effect that's.
Yeah, there's something strange about the way in which once you start playing with the images, it very quickly, the sort of tables turn in terms of the order of things, and the sort of ease of the figures within the landscape suddenly starts to kind of break down. Mm-hmm. Actually, one thing that perhaps we ought to mention is you know, the series of blogs, because I'm not sure that everybody who's here tonight will have be aware of them, is the series of blogs that you've written in response to the archive, and the one that I've recently written, which I think has become a kind of conversation between us as well.
That's true. There's a question for you, Rona. The relationship between...
I don't know why I'm not seeing the chat at the moment. I'll try and turn it on. Yeah.
Read it out. The question, the relationship between human and non-human. Do you consider non-human things like rocks or the sea are sentient and have an impact on how you relate to them?
I'll just close that chat window. I think that's a really interesting question. I think I didn't say this, but in an earlier version of what I read out, I had talked about this question of rocks, and in a sense, in relative terms, the sort of sense of them being non-sentient. But again, having that, because now I'm working with whether they're geological samples or whether they're souvenirs or whether there's these very ascetized rocks which appear in East Asian culture, they are removed from a landscape, so they become artifacts in a sense. But I think I'm interested in them partly because, unlike other species, so say working with birds or botanical items, things that grow, there's a sense of this sort of dense, static entity. So the question of how do you begin to think about a sort of another way of engaging with the non-human when you're dealing with a rock, I think is particularly challenging. But that, for me, what it makes it interesting for me, and it stops me slipping into the danger of sort of anthropomorphizing something, I think, in the way that one might if you were doing some sort of work with a bird, say. I mean, I'm speculating. So I think, yeah, I'm not so much interested in the sort of absoluteness of whether they're sentient or not, but more, again, a kind of resistance that comes up in a way that I think, yeah, is of interest to me. I hope that answers that question. So.
And there's a sort of unknowability there, isn't there, in terms of classification? I mean, that's something that, again, I think crosses over in elements of both your practices. And, you know, you talked about a sort of things that kind of resist captioning, things that maybe begin to sort of evade classification, and yet the function of the archive, for instance, is to enable objects or information to be retrievable. So it has to be labeled. So I wondered if, you know, again, you know, both of you, either of you, perhaps could say a little bit more about perhaps that kind of resistance of matter and of things to classification, and therefore being fully acquired by us as knowledge.
Louise, do you want to take that one first?
I didn't. It fully sort of fits, but perhaps it just picks up again on what you were saying. But I was just thinking about the last blog entry I did with the Galena, which has been sitting on the shelf over here. And I probably shouldn't be handling it because it is lead. Anyway, I'll wash my hands in a bit. But I realised that, you know, the kind of relationship with these kind of rocks, these specimens, in terms of the use they have. And I probably didn't realise at the time, but I was utterly fascinated by this, the use of galena in terms of acting as a crystal and used within crystal sets, used to transmit voices and so on. And I used a sort of little caption as a footnote, actually. And I realized that it was my logic was about proclaiming its use, you know, rather than letting it stand on its own ground. It had to be there, had to be seen as useful. And then, but in order to activate it, I had to really be quite aggressive and physical with it. I was sort of smashing it up. I was sort of bombarding this voice through it. I was sitting on a kind of sheet of tracing paper on top of an old cassette recorder in order to get these kind of dust particles to dance around. So it was an interesting one, actually. Thinking, I'm not sure where I'm going with this, but it just something about this quite. You know, I think it's interesting, going back to your postcards again, kind of what we're doing to this, whether it's the rocket, the material itself, or the depiction or representation of it. You know, the kind of, you know, the violence that we're kind of enacting on it. And yeah, it's curious.
Yeah, I suppose for me there are two things that come to mind. One is that when I did the work with the Oceanography Centre, I was really interested in this landscape that I literally couldn't go to, you know, and what that was going to do. I suppose because, you know, there's a lot of artists who work in different ways with landscape and site and place and all those things. And I mean, there was a secondary place that I went to, which was the Oceanography Centre itself. And in part, I started studying the scientists, studying the deep sea, you know, this sort of secondary mechanism, you know, and I suppose you know, it's easy to, in another way, to romanticize exactly that, the sea as a resistant, uncategorizable kind of fluid. But I think that has to be, you know, balanced with the knowledge, of course, that it's a highly politicized economic space. You know, it is not a free space. I mean, there are certain kind of legal dimensions to it, the law of the sea, which actually operate very differently from land. And that's something I've done a piece of work about as well. So there are ways in which it is different, but it sort of exists in this interesting situation, sort of both outside of culture in one sense. I mean, you know, it is named, but it's not inhabited. It doesn't carry the histories of inhabitation that landscape, you know, dry landscape carries. But at the same time, you know, and particularly in the last kind of 20 years or so, you know, it's increasingly subject to legal territorial grabs, to you know, undersea mining and so forth, carbon dumping, etc., etc. So you know, that was a sort of interesting space that I kind of demanded a sort of a very different approach. I was going to say something else about resistance, and it's slightly gone out of my head. It might come back to me, but just, yeah, that was one example of a kind of resistance. Oh, I know you were talking about archives and categorization and collections. So I suppose, you know, one thing that's interesting me at the moment in thinking about these rocks is that depending, I mean, this might not be literally the case, because the sort of rocks that are understood as what's called scholars' rocks, so they're part of a philosophical tradition whereby they become kind of portals into a kind of understanding of the vitality of the world. They sit on the desk, but they become these kind of transports into a kind of understanding of nature. I mean, they're very particular aesthetically, so they're not the sort of things that you might pick up on the trip to Hawaii, but nevertheless, in one sense, the three categories of rock collecting that I mentioned, you know, the same specimen potentially could appear in all three of them and would have entirely different meanings. And that kind of interests me, you know, the sense that the attempt to collect and categorize that actually breaks down very quickly, because it's not about the objects, you know, it's not about understanding the geological sample and where it came from. It's about the framework that you place around it. And I think that, you know, I guess one of my interests in geological samples in particular is I think that we've gone through all sorts of kind of, you know, reconsideration of museum collections and artifacts within them. But there's something about rocks, because again, a bit like the deep sea, they're not kind of, they're not first and foremost a sort of a cultural artifact. They are, of course, because they've been collected by somebody, they've been bought, they've been labeled, you know, they have kind of shifted into culture. But I think there's something about that, that, you know, they're not, they need to be reframed. They need to be reframed from a post-colonial perspective. They need to be reframed from a post-natural perspective, you know, and I think that's one of the things that I'm interested in, but they're not the sort of obvious candidates in a sense for either of those investigations.
So much the better, perhaps.
Yes, well, yes, I quite like these. I do like obscure, slightly off-center things, I think.
So you were speaking there about, in a way, the think about the ocean, for instance, as something which cannot so easily be subjected to, say, mapping technologies. So that overlap between, you know, territory and the kind of the earth, it doesn't map in quite the same way. So sensing technologies rather than kind of visual technologies need to be used. So again, we have this, I think we have this kind of emphasis on means of sensing as perhaps being other ways of knowing. And you mentioned almost, you know, the rocks as almost having, giving us a sort of access to a kind of sensibility that takes us elsewhere. So whether that's into a different temporality, sort of geologic time, or the sense of these objects from far away. So I wonder whether, you know, again, this is a kind of a question to you both really about, you know, the use of kind of sensing the earth, or sensitivity to things that go beyond almost the capacities of human sense.
Yeah.
So something that exceeds our vision or our hearing or our ability to touch through technology.
Well, I suppose, you know, in terms of early bathymetric mapping, it was done by lines being dropped down. So there was a kind of, you know, it was in the work that I made in response to the Oceanography Centre. I did a video piece in which a blind woman is reading a text with Braille, and you see her fingers running over it. And I think in a sense that was an attempt to sort of somehow capture this interest in a kind of a desire for connection, an attempt to sense, but one that isn't simply visual. I mean, of course, the actual processes they now use are involve forms of data manipulation. So they're kind of creating virtual environments on the screen. But even so, there are still moments when they attempt to actually get samples from the seabed. And that's called ground truthing. So this idea that there are different sort of levels, if you like, of authentication or sensing. And I think there's something in that I'm interested in. And I think there's a tension. I think I'm really interested in the tension of between the desire for knowledge, the desire for connection, and the part of me also wants things to remain inaccessible. So I think I think that may be one of the things that I'm interested in.
So there's that touching, there's that sense of the tactile and the touch as being something that brings something close. So that overcoming of, you know, proximity and distance through touch, I think is a really powerful impulse as well.
But there's also something called reach touch, which is the idea that you can almost, I think this relates to some work that you were very interested in, Louise, around the haptic, but this idea of a sort of a kind of sensation that isn't that synthesizes visual and sort of visual and physical contact, but neither are actually happening, and it becomes a form of, you know, I think when I'm talking about imagining and the imagination, I think I'm partly interested in the ways that sort of sense of what you might call imaginary perception actually becomes something to work with. And I think that's partly because I think that's one of the capacity that artists in particular have in a way that, you know, isn't necessarily available to other disciplines. I'm really interested in working in an interdisciplinary way, but I think, you know, it is perhaps a particular capacity of artists in the broadest sense, you know. So that's something I've become interested, almost the kind of politics of the imagination.
When you were talking about when you went down in the submersible with the oceanographers.
I didn't, Louise, fantasize that. Okay. That's the sort of thing you would do.
That's funny. I was so sure that you had, but you were able to activate the
I did use underwater cameras, and I did go on a research vessel.
Yeah.
But actually, very, very few people go down in the submersible. So I can't even say it. But I did use for a very brief moment, I was allowed to use their underwater cameras. I went on they call them cruises, and I went on what was called it was a testing cruise. So hence I was allowed to do some limited play with a bit of equipment, and I sent some things down to the seabed that were then kind of released out, and they, because of the pressure, they shrunk. Yes, I think I had about 3 minutes of use of the cameras, so it wasn't something, unfortunately, I could have.
Okay. In my mind, there was some sort of force feedback, and you were feeling the ocean floor. But,
no, I wish. But I think in a way, you know, when there's another kind of immersion, isn't there? There's the immersion in a place or a form of knowledge production or a community of people where, and this is something you've done a lot of, and I have as well, where, you know, it can be sort of 3 to 5 years working around something. I mean, the actual moment when you're there, wherever there is, may be quite short, but actually, in the, you know, as part of that process, you've still been reflecting and absorbing and learning, you know, prior to that. So I think there is a kind of there's an immersion in a context which isn't necessarily the same as a actual location, if you see what I mean.
yes, absolutely. I mean, for me, obviously, a kind of example of that, I showed a few sides of it, was the project with that Alan Smith initiated in Small Clough Mine, where we were underground in this diffuse-lead mine for 72 hours. And yes, that was absolutely writ large, that aspect of sensing, of realizing just how quickly you could acculturate. You'd have to rely on other senses in that kind of depleted visual context. Things started to shift very quickly, and as I mentioned, you know, about the role of sensation, very quickly floods the situation, and so we were all actually hallucinating quite quickly, within probably about a day or so. Not in a sort of altered images, William Hurt sort of way, but in just starting to see things, hear things, and compensating really for things that we were missing. So we were hearing birdsong, we were imagining a kind of night sky in a darkened tunnel. So it was very quickly. It was interesting to me, just I suppose how rapid that sort of process can take over. So yeah, but and the technology was an interesting adjunct to that, because it kind of corroborated the strangeness of it. We were sure that it was picking up things which weren't there, and we were seeing things which we didn't see subsequently. So yeah, the kind of relationship between these devices that were very quickly giving us access to other kind of mythologies around a place that we were fabricating.
And I mean, that term that you used, Rona, there, kind of reach touch. I mean, again, this really evokes for me the way that you've been working, Louise, with trying to reach touch the archive at a distance. And its materials, and to maybe rematerialize them, or to think about what happens in that process of reaching and touching and trying to work with and make sense of, in an imaginative way, not only in a sense of archival retrieval way. Yes.
I mean, that had been a sort of very strong desire early on, and I think I talked about it last time. This idea to kind of have, you know, having had a large chunk of the archive beamed to me, as it were, to then reconstruct it and reconstitute it as a sort of transmission, or you know, like a science fiction movement of something to somewhere else. So, and it's not really going away. I'm still wanting that tactility. I'm wanting to touch stuff, to print it out, to do something with it. I mean, I know I need to switch gear a little bit with what I'm doing with the archive, and that will happen. But it's unbelievably pleasurable. I can't actually describe it, just to have this resource to disappear into and to play with. It's back to travel, armchair travel that Rona was talking about at the start of traveling at a distance, the role of the imaginary. You know, I still have this idea, I still have this image of the archive as being underground, and not not straightforward. You know, that it has a kind of other qualities that I'm sure it doesn't in real life, but it suits my purpose to imagine it as expansive.
I think there's something interesting in all of this, which is, of course, the question of access and who gets to go, and the long histories of that being a certain, certain class of person, usually male, that the sort of explorer and the person who can only sort of, is denied that sort of access. And I think I was reading some criticism of nature writing, and I forget, I'd have to check her name, but there was a sort of quote saying something about the lone Cambridge male appears over the horizon. I mean, she was actually talking about Robert Macfarlane, but this sort of sense that the lack of a critical framework. I mean, I'm not saying that about him. I don't feel sufficiently familiar with his work, but this is what she was flagging up, that the sort of critical framework around questions of access needed to be brought into play more. And I do always remember thinking, when I heard Richard Long sort of walks out the back door and disappears for kind of 10 days, well, somebody is possibly still left in the house, and those sorts of questions, I think gender, certainly historically, and indeed, class and race are all configured in these sort of questions of access. So I suppose it's, just something that is an important kind of framework to place around the broader question of access and travel.
And the impetus of the collector.
Yes.
I mean, in terms of, the discipline of geology, I mean, in Catherine Yusuf's critique of, the role of geology, the implication of geology within colonialism and racism in her critique. I mean, again, I think that a kind of innocent view of the world as a resource, or even a kind of a geology as a discipline for, in some neutral way, extracting information from the world, not just extracting resources. I mean, that doesn't feel that we can sustain a view of its innocence, really, rather than its complicity.
Yes.
In the building of knowledges that actually have proved, as we know, to be very damaging for our planet.
Thank you. I can see that Judith has put in, it was Kathleen Jamie. She's given me the quote. I did have it earlier today. The lone enraptured male. Yes, thank you. I think she did subsequently sort of slightly draw back from that, but on a personal level. But I think the kind of point is nevertheless fairly succinctly made about a sort of, a lineage, if you like, that has a bearing on things.
So it's privileged access. It's also a certain sense of a privileged view. The gaze, that acquisitive gaze that can look on landscape and extract knowledge from it, but maybe also possess it in some sense as a result of that knowledge gathering.
And I think allied to that is sort of romanticization of the wild and the rural as well. And, this point has been made by others, but I think, if we want to think about not just landscape, but nature, I mean, one of the reasons I included at the beginning of my slideshow, those images of artificial plants in an urban environment. I mean, that's something I've become very interested in, the sort of ways in which, you go to any kind of, area where there are bars in an urban centre, and so many of them have flowers all around the outside, all of which are plastic and silk or whatever, and this very strange sort of sense, once you start looking, of how much apparent nature exists in the urban landscape. So as I think it's again, I'm interested in talking about categories, a sort of deconstruction of that category nature, and also a sort of expansion of it, because what one thing isn't necessarily more sort of authentic, if you like, than the other. And I think there's something again about that slightly sort of flipped way. I mean, even I've got interested in landscapes in aquariums and things like that, so.
Yeah, I mean, I was just perhaps a final question really for me, and then maybe we do move into the questions that have been accumulating in the chat. Is perhaps more of a reflection than a question, but obviously the critique and the reevaluation of categories and forms of knowledge that cluster in this term Anthropocene, and all of that. All that it throws into question, and often is about thinking of us as geologic agents, but something that I think is in say some of, I mean, you mentioned Jasinski, but also his work with Nigel Clarke as well, thinking about the way that the geologic is also in us and maybe it's not so much us thinking of our impact on the world, but thinking much more closely about the way that the world shapes us, both socially and physically. And so that sense of the sensing of the geologic that's in both your practices, I find very interesting. Because of that, there is the sense of the geologic being made to speak through your work.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, at a sort of fairly literal level, I have thought quite a bit about, some sort of one thing I might look into would be, the minerals in the body, and then minerals, the same minerals in other contexts. But I think you're talking about something that's sort of more multi-layered than that, but I think, yes, that's that sense of a kind of permeability between the human and the non-human, or the geologic and the physiological, is very interesting. And I think it's a really, how to work with that is a whole other question. What vocabularies do you use to kind of, I mean, there's obviously a sort of documentary mode around the Anthropocene. But I suppose, again, I've sort of begun to feel, well, maybe in the same way that, perhaps a kind of literal engagement with place or landscape has limitations, partly because of some of the histories that we're talking about, maybe a documentary mode also has some kind of problems folded into it. I mean, the sort of most obvious cases of what's been called a kind of eco-porn of, sort of disaster photography of, the spoiled earth. But as I say, speaking personally, I feel that, that's an exploration I've kind of yet to make, to find what are the material and visual languages that would, the thinking is there, but the question of how to actually work with this, I think, is one that I'm sort of trying to get to grips with, but still feel very early on in that process.
Well, that's a new aesthetic that's called for, isn't it? It's a new form of kind of sensitivity, sensing and sensibility of the world. And you mentioned that sense of the permeability. And I was just thinking of Louise picking up her lump of galena and saying, oh no, that's the lead. That's the lead that could leach into my body through touch.
Yes. Yeah.
Well, is this a good moment at 8:05 to
Oh, yes.
hand over? Although I feel we've, there's so many more things that we could, that are yet to discuss, but it would be delightful now. I wonder if I can, should I hand back to you, Sarah, to pick up some of the questions that have been accumulating in the chat?
We have Joanne Pemberton has raised her hand. I think she may want to. I'm going to unmute her.
Oh, sorry, that was an accident.
Oh, it was an accident. Okay.
Sorry.
All right.
We've got lots of things in the chat. I'm
Yeah.
just going to try and sort of see if I can expand my view of it, because at the moment I can only see a few bits. But okay. So
there's a question from Carrie Patterson, who's intrigued by the issue of human non-human relationships in terms of the climate crisis. She realizes that this is zooming out quite a lot from your project, but she'd love to know what you and Louise both have to say.
I think, well, gosh, I mean, I guess there is a question that, we all have to ask ourselves about whether actually our real focus should be on, direct action around climate change. I mean, I was discussing with another artist friend the other day, whether thinking around the issue is enough, or, whether this sort of sense of an exploration of the situation and the proposition of a sort of shift in non-human relationships. I'm whether that needs to actually translate into something much more immediate. And I guess that's a question we all have to ask ourselves individually. Don't think it's a kind of easy one to answer in some senses, but I think, this friend I was speaking to had spoken to another artist who said, we have to stop making art. We just have to become activists, So, and it's a valid point, I think. I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Absolutely, I think that's spot on, Rona. I know it's a very distinct issue, but I've been following the H2S activism, obviously from a distance, and feeling very, yes, just that need actually just to actually actively engage and not just to read around something, rather than to worry about the theorizing at this point. Sorry, that's a bit of a lame answer, but
well, I don't think there are any easy answers. There's another question for Louise, I think.
Okay, you mentioned well, it was my father was a geologist. His hobby was a holiday curse. That's true. I was wondering, do you think it was this initial irritation and disinterest of the topic that brought a newfound curiosity to it later on in your life? I think utterly. I mean, I don't know why it was. I think it was just the pace. Obviously, just as a child, it was a very slow activity of quite a damaging, actually, chipping away at cliff faces to get things out, and then the endless photography of these things. I've got archives and boxes and boxes of these sort of slightly out of focus photographs of uncaptioned images of rocks. So I think it's maybe just that complete distance between the kind of tactile pleasure, the weightiness, the handling of something, and the way that perhaps I saw in his interest in it, which was a kind of maybe back to that kind of mastery, that naming, that ticking things off like a kind of birder aspect of it. But then actually just seeing it less as a discipline and more as being enraptured by engagement with particular places, and it being the geology, and it's somehow seeming less fraught than other kind of and other environments or other places to go to.
and coming away with that object and that image, which again makes me think of, you know, the actions of people in the Cheltenham volumes wanting to, you know, that capturing and recording.
Yes, in very great detail.
Actually, one thing it also makes me think about is when I read that figure that there are 5 to 6 million specimens in UK university geological collections alone. I mean, if you just, you know, some fantasy on my part was to get them all and place them in a pile. And I was just trying to think, what volume of stuff are we talking about here? It's a huge number. And it also kind of chimes with, I read somewhere, and again, I don't have the, you know, this in a kind of, you know, accurate sense, but that humankind have had greater impact, literally re-sculpted the planet to a greater extent than all seismic activity. Yes. You know, I mean, as I say, I can't remember all the detail. I do have it somewhere in something I've written in the past, but this sort of realization, when I was working with the undersea geographers, their renderings of the undersea environment gave me a very significant sense of the Earth as a dynamic entity, but also as a sort of surface, you know, a continuous surface, rather than a place that's divided up by borders and different kinds of terrains. I mean, it's partly because they just take all, you know, certain kinds of detail out. But then the idea that, you know, we're literally reshaping it. We are sculptors of the planet. I just somehow find that a kind of really sort of overwhelming idea, you know. So I think, yeah, there's something about, you know, going back to your dad sort of chipping off his little sample, you know, it's that times however many, you know, and that sort of, I find something in that quite affecting.
The sheer volume.
Yes.
Imagine that as a volume in those collections. Yeah. That's...
And I did some things where I was doing tracings on carbon paper of satellite images of open cast mines, and I was really interested in those as a sort of almost a kind of sculptural form, and the negative space of what's removed. So yeah, that's something that I've sort of been thinking about quite a bit.
My dad actually had this cartoon pinned near his collection of rocks, and it was the exasperated wife of the male amateur geologist saying, perhaps we could just smash them all up and repave the drive with them, which I don't know, I was just thinking about, you know, one person's collection in a cabinet, but then it could just actually be, you know, the weight could be relocated somewhere else and reapplied.
Cyclical landscapes. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, there's perhaps a slightly related question here for you, Louise, which is asking you to talk a little bit about the sense of absent presence in your sound works.
Oh, what? Anything particular about it? Sorry, I can't see the question.
That just says the question that they would like to hear you say a little bit more about the sense of absent presence in the sound works. So maybe maybe either what's not there, or that somehow that apparatus is capturing.
That's a really good question
for us, perhaps beyond what we could actually hear with human hearing.
Yes, I mean that's really interesting, and you're kind of very aware of it when you're recording about that act of listening and a kind of filling in of silence or lack of loud sounds at any rate. I mean, I sort of use various microphones that can amplify things which are very, very quiet or otherwise inaudible. So there's suddenly a kind of what seems like to the human sensory system seems quite quiet, actually is a very noisy, very very vibrant place. So and I'm interested in other artists who work with that, who work with kind of processes or devices to amplify, to layer, to mirror recordings, to do that. And that's one of the things we were doing in the mine, actually, we were doing a sort of Alvin Lucia, where we were kind of playing with the resonance within the mine and amplifying it, feeding it back, and kind of merging our voices, our presences with the place itself. So I think I mean, it serves multiple purposes. It's, you know, for the places like the kind of built, fraught places like the military sites, it's a kind of place to speak about the kind of lack of captioning, the things that aren't said, that can't be known about a place. What else? I mean, it's kind of, it can be lots of things. It can hold lots of possibility. Yeah. I don't know if that answers the question.
We probably have time for maybe one more question. I don't know if you have anything that you'd like to say, Jean, or shall I find something from the
There's
from
so
the
many
chat?
wonderful questions. Do you want to pick a question out? I'm just trying to scan through them.
There's a question here from Judith Tucker about the image of the pile of rocks and specimens and the idea of the landscape as archive. She worries that this might be a big question, but do either of you want to pick up on that idea?
Well, I suppose there's a sense in which landscapes are, in a variety of different ways, shaped by human activity and have been. So in that sense, they are archaeological sites, which is what we tend to associate with, you know, sites of human occupation. But whilst that might not be evident, there are still ways in which landscape has been changed. So I suppose that's a sense in which it functions as an archive. It's not something I've sort of considered particularly. Louise?
No, I can't. Sorry, Judy. I'm going to have to ruminate on this. It's a really, you know, it's got all the key words, and I'm not quite. I think I need to sort of sit with that and see how that. It's an interesting one. I'll do a blog about it.
I suppose it's an archive of such immense sort of temporality. It's an archive of the changing earth. Yeah. So it's, in that sense, it's archival of, you know, ancient sunshine trapped in those layers of oil, and, you know, in that sense, it's an archive of something of the inhuman.
Well, you know, geology as a field of study is a kind of archival study in that sense, isn't it? You know, in terms of kind of reading time. But again, it's a particular kind of framing in terms of, what is being understood and what is being measured. But I suppose the reading of strata is what I'm thinking about there. But I'm not a geologist. I have thought I might have to go off and do a little bit of an introduction.
I think, coming back to that landscape, I'm sort of really thinking about, I did a project many years ago in Duke's Wood in Nottinghamshire, which is a kind of Britain's only inland oil field. And that was fascinating, just to be aware of some of these uncapped pipes that were still going down into the ground. You could still smell the oil. And the kind of awareness of almost this kind of sensory, not just sensory, but a kind of physical direct line down into this kind of matter that was of such kind of an age that is impossible to imagine. And it was, yes, this kind of image of this machine, a kind of device that could kind of pull this out of the ground was very very powerful. And you know, what is it that could be pulled out? Could it be images? Could it be other sorts of resources, other sorts of mythologies that are somehow sort of latent within this landscape and these means that have been built. I don't know if that makes sense, but it was that was something that was going through my mind at the time, being able to actually access the kind of oil from a different time span.
I wonder if this might be a good time to draw the conversation to a close. There's some really interesting comments and further questions in the chat, so it might be if anyone wants to save the chat to have a look at later, then that would be a good time to do that now. Unless there's any.
Are you able to do that, Sarah? Because then maybe Rona and me could answer them on a blog or something.
Sure, I will do that, absolutely. Of course, the conversation.
Save them as well.
Sure. The conversation will be available on the Hardwick Gallery website, and you can go and check out the blog. That's hardwickgallery.org. And so I just like to thank Rona, Louise and Jean for a really fascinating conversation. Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who joined us this evening and for all those questions and comments. As I've said, the recording will be available, and do sign up to the mailing list on the Hardwick Gallery website as well, because then you'll hear about updates to the project and any further events. So I'll say good night to everyone. Keep safe, keep well, and goodbye. And hand over back to Jean.
So thank you again, and a huge thank you to Rona and to Louise, and also to our really highly engaged audience. I've been trying to save the chat so that we can return to some of these questions, because there is so much more to explore. So thank you so much to everybody.
And thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you very much to Jean and to Sarah, and thank you so much, Rona.
Oh, yeah, it's been really interesting, both the conversations with Sarah, Jean and Louise prior to this, but I'm also seeing a lot of names of people who I know's work is, you know, in here tonight, as it were, whose work is doing, you know, is also fascinating in regard of these things. So it's great to feel, you know, a sense of shared community around these ideas. So thank you very much for everyone who's participated. Yeah, great.
I'm having to keep collecting the chat as more and more things, links and wonderful things come in. Fantastic. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording now.